Okay, we are now live. Thank you for those who joined us on the Zoom meeting and those who will start watching us on Facebook. Welcome to our Arab Normalization lecture hosted by International Association for Political Science Students, the branch of United States and Canada, IAPSS, International Association for Political Science Students, short for IAPSS, is present on all continents and has 6 region branches. Each branch hosts its own events and has different activities and opportunities for students. This particular branch is works on the continent of the United States and Canada, North America. And today we're happy to host an event on the new paradigm and relations between Arab countries and Israel. And our speaker today is Ezzeldeen Masri. He is the director at OneVoice Movement, director of United States, director of outreach in the United States. Ezzeldeen was born in Gaza City in 1971 and moved to Chicago in 1990 for college. He has a master's in international relations, specializing in conflict resolution. In 2000, Ezzeldeen moved back to Gaza, working as a social studies teacher with the American International School. In 2006, he opened the OneVoice Palestine Gaza office. He is Palestinian American, and today he will be sharing with us about the history of the situation there and this history of relations between Arab countries in Israel, and why the normalization is happening now in 2020, and what it means for the Middle East and what it means for the world. Ezzeldeen, you can take over.
Yes, hi. Thank you very much for hosting me. As you mentioned, I'm Palestinian American, and also I am involved for the past 14 years with OneVoice Movement, and my work mainly focuses on preparing the ground for two-state solution between Israel and Palestinians. When it comes to the normalization, the recent normalization with Arab states such as United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Sudan with the state of Israel, you have to take into consideration that these 3 states actually, in particular Emirates and Bahrain and Sudan, they don't have the common borders with Israel. And they don't have an actual conflict, for example, over borders, over national resources. They're very far away from each other's, and they never went into war actually between each other's. Okay, and the problem has to do with Palestine, with the Arabs of Palestine. As you know, there are 21 countries plus Palestine, 21, and those are Arabs, and this is nationalism. And up until the collapse of the Caliphate, the Ottomans, the Turks, following the defeat of Turkey in World War I, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Prior to that, the Arabs were just Arabs. You know, you could travel from Saudi to Sudan, from Beirut to Damascus, from Damascus to Gaza, Algeria, Morocco. Everything was open when the Ottomans were there. For 500 years, the Turks were there and everything was open. So prior to that, also you have the Arabs, the Abbasi dynasty, the Umayyad dynasty, you have Prophet Muhammad, you know, they coming out, okay? So you have pan-Arabism. You have this huge area in the Eastern Mediterranean that are Arabs. They share religion, they share language, destiny. It's Arab nationalism. So that's why we have the problem between Israel and these Arab countries. It's not because Israel has a problem with Algeria or with Tunisia or with Mauritania or with Turkey or with Bangladesh. Israel has no problem. They have no problem over natural resources. They have no problem over borders. It's just the fact that the Palestinians are Arabs. That's one. And two, they are Muslims. And when you say Muslims, there is 1.7 billion Muslims around the world. And Arabs, as I told you, there's 21 Arab countries. So when it comes to normalization and anti-normalization, this is Arabs supporting Palestinians, supporting them for what? Supporting that, the conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This something has been going on for almost a century, since the Balfour Declaration, since World War I, and the establishment of the state of Israel and the war, and the subsequent removal of 670,000 Palestinians, who are now 6 million, and the war of 1967, Israel occupied the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. And now you have the occupation going on for almost like now 53 years, military occupation. I lived under military occupation. It's bad. It's the worst. When you live, I grew up in Gaza, like you said, in 1971. So it's a military occupation. And it's the worst to live under military occupation, because you have a foreigner controlling you in your home, in your neighborhood, and telling you what to do. So that's why there is the problem between the Arab nations, states, and the state of Israel, because of the Israeli occupation. So the problem between Israel and Palestine affects how the Arabs look at Israel. And that's why you have the boycott of Israel. And that's why you had also in the 60s, following the defeat of the Arab countries, the three no's: no to Israel, no to normalization, and this had no to peace, and this happened in Sudan and Khartoum. So that's the background. That's why the Arabs are not talking to Israel and boycotting Israel. This has to do with the fact that there's a problem between their brothers in Palestine, the Arabs, the Muslims, with the state of Israel. Now, many attempts were introduced to end Israel-Palestine conflict. Many, from 1948 until now. However, none of them worked. The most recent serious one was in Camp David in 2000, between Chairman Yasser Arafat, back then, chairman of the PLO, and back then Ehud Olmert, the prime minister of Israel. And the Americans were the hosts, President Clinton, and there was an offer offered by Bill Clinton on behalf of Ehud Barak, and it didn't work out. The Palestinians did not accept the offer, and it collapsed, the negotiation. And then uprising followed, deadly one. Many Israelis died, and many Palestinians also died too. So from 2000 until 2020, that's 20 years. We had a stalemate after Camp David negotiation. What's the Palestinians are negotiating for with the Israelis? What are the Israelis and the Palestinians negotiating for? Well, as I said, the occupation started in 1967, June 1967. And in 1993, there was the Oslo Accord, brokered by the Norwegians. And it speculated that in 1999, they should conclude all the negotiations, and then a permanent solution will ensue. Well, they were supposed to talk about the borders. They were supposed to talk about the fate of the refugees. They were supposed to talk about Jerusalem and natural resources, security arrangements. And that's what they tried to talk about in Camp David, and it did not work out. So from there until 2020, we had also one initiative that is also Yehud Olmert, the Prime Minister of Israel, offering the Mahmoud Abbas a solution based on the two-state vision. Mahmoud Abbas did not agree to it. So 20 years of stalemate until we had President Trump coming up with his peace plan. Now, the Palestinians rejected the peace plan because they view it as less than the two-state solution that the international community agreed on. And that's what the PLO wanted. And that's what Oslo was supposed to do. It's based on the 1967 borders. So basically introduce something that is not based on the 1967 borders. And the PLO refused it. And President Mahmoud Abbas boycotted the American administration. Now, there's two ways of doing negotiations. Either you go direct, okay, between the two warring nations, or you go regional. And I believe President Trump and his team came to a conclusion that yes, the Israelis agreed for the peace plan, but the Palestinians refused to even talk about it. So let's try to ignore the Palestinians and let's try to do this on the regional level. And that's what happened. You had Kushner and Pompeo totally boycotting the Palestinians and going around and holding conferences in Bahrain. Yes, they invited the Palestinians for it, but the Palestinians did not show up. And the Israelis, by the way, did not show up. So it was strange, you know, holding a conference in Bahrain for Israel-Palestine peace, but Israel and Palestine are not there. Anyway, the Israelis are, I mean, the Netanyahu government are in full support of it, but the Palestinians are not. So the Americans and the Israelis, okay, somehow decided, okay, we're not gonna go direct, let's go regional. So they went regional, and here comes the normalization. But why did Bahrain and Emirat, who were founded in 1971, by the way, not long time ago, prior to that, they were under the British control. So why did they decide to normalize, make relations normal with Israel prior to ending the Israeli occupation of the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and reaching a solution as in the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002? What made them do that? Why? We have 20 Arab countries. Why not Algeria? Why not Tunisia? Why Bahrain? Why United Arab Emirates? Why Sudan? Yeah, why? I tell you why. Because Bahrain and United Arab Emirates, they have national interests to protect. These are nation states that are threatened by Iran. Iran is right next to Bahrain. In 20 minutes, the fast Iranian boats could be in Bahrain. They could occupy Bahrain in like 1 hour, the whole island. And also the population of Bahrain are mostly Shia, but the ruling family of Bahrain, Khalifa family, are Sunni. So the ruling family, okay, they see in Israel their salvation, because the Americans are leaving. The Americans are telling everybody we're leaving. They're leaving from Syria, they're leaving from Iraq, they're leaving. So they, you know, so, and we've seen what happened when bombed Aramco company, the Saudi company, Aramco. They bombed it with missiles. And the Americans didn't respond back to protect their allies, the Saudis. So these sheikdoms, these Arab kingdoms, they lose in faith in America. It's not like when George Bush went and sent an army to liberate Kuwait in 1991. It's different time now. So who's the regional power they can resort for protection? Israel. Now Israel will protect Bahrain. Now the Persians will think 1,000 times before trying to attack Bahrain, or before they try to attack Emirat. They will think thousands times before they do so, because Israel then would be there with their F-16s and with their army to defend the Bahrainis and to defend the Emiratis against the Persians. That's how they look at it. Sudan. Why Sudan? Why would Sudan normalize with Israel? Why President Abdel Fattah Burhan and Abdullah Hamdouk, Dr. Abdullah Hamdouk, the Prime Minister, normalize with Israel? Sudan has no borders with Israel. They have no natural resources to fight about. The Sudanese are Arabs and Muslims. Therefore, they're not talking to the Israelis because they're mad with Israel. They want Israel to end this occupation, military occupation, and allow the Palestinians to practice national self-determination and have their own state. Two-state solution. All the Arab countries and the Muslim countries, we have 20 Arab countries plus 70 Muslim countries, that's 90 countries. That's one bloc. All these countries, they said, we agree to the Arab Peace Initiative, which was introduced in 2002 by the Saudis and the Arab League. What does it say, the Arab Peace Initiative? All the Muslim states around the world and the Arab states will make peace with Israel, will normalize with Israel, including Turkey, and including Iran, and including Pakistan. We will normalize with Israel, will make permanent peace with Israel, will exchange embassies with Israel, but Israel has to end this occupation that started in June 5th, 1967. Israel has to allow the Palestinians to have a state to practice national self-determination. The Palestinians are 12 million people. They are not 1 or 2 or 3. They are 12 million. 6 of them are within the River Jordan and the Mediterranean, and there is 6 million in the diaspora. They want a state. So that's when it comes to the normalizations between the Arab states and Israel. Israel is interested in normalization because Israel was under isolation for the past 73 years. They've been under boycott and isolation for the past 72 years, since 1948, since the establishment of the State of Israel. Israel was born in a sea of Arabs and Muslims. Israel was born in a sea of Arabs and Muslims. And those Arabs and Muslims, they boycotted Israel from the first day that Israel was born, and they sent armies. The Saudis sent armies, the Syrians sent armies, the Lebanese, the Egyptians, the Iraqis, they all did to fight the Jewish state. And that was in 1948. And since then, that's 72 years, it's a state of war between the Arabs and the State of Israel. And now, after 72 years, we see in these two countries, we're seeing countries now trying to make peace with Israel. And I think that's victory for Israel and for Benjamin Netanyahu to be able to normalize relation with Sudan, Bahrain, and United Arab Emirates, and those are Arab countries and Muslim countries, before the end of the occupation. Because the problem in the end is the occupation. I'm Palestinian, I'm pro-peace, I'm pro-two states, and that's what I do. And I believe in that since I was very young, maybe since I was 17 years old. I believe that the two-state solution, a negotiated two-state solution between Israel and the PLO, is the solution, resulting in two states. And maybe these two states will have like somehow confederation agreements when it comes to environment, security, economic, infrastructure, and they can live right next to each other's in peace and security. But until that happens, I find it very difficult for Palestinians to agree to normalization and peace with Israel, because no one's likes to live under military occupation, foreign military occupation. As I said in the beginning, it robs you of your freedom, your dignity, and your humanity. When someone who is foreign to the country comes with guns and tanks and subjugate you, the native, come into your house, your backyard, your street, your city, your town, just because they are more powerful than you and they have bigger guns, and subjugate you, and shoot you, arrest you, interrogate you, set up checkpoints. So until Israel and the PLO agree on the negotiation tables and find the solution to these issues, the borders, the refugees, Jerusalem, national resources, security arrangements, until they find out about these issues and they find a solution for them and come up with a peace accord between the Palestinians and the Israeli government, I think normalization is not going to happen. Maybe it happens with governments, but it's not going to happen with the people themselves. Because, as I said before, Israel has no problem with the Arab world. They have no problem, as I said. The problem is the Israeli occupation of Palestine. And once that ended, I think the Arabs and the Muslim will have no reason to boycott Israel. Yes. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Zeldin. Do you want to explain the station in the context of MAPS, the regional station, with peace accords and the proposed Trump solution?
Yeah.
Sure, let's do that. So this is, actually, no, let's switch to.
Yeah, let's do the one with the
first one.
Yeah, so this is the 1967 borders. They call the green line, as you see. This is the green. This is the town of Jenin, and this is the farthest point in the North Bank. Jenin in the north, all the way. This is Jenin, okay, and all the way down is Hebron. So this is the green line. This is the West Bank, okay. It's around the. Let's say this is so in comparison to Palestine, mandated Palestine, that starts from all the way the Lebanese border and it ends all the way by the Red Sea, okay, which is 27,000 kilometers. 27,000 kilometers. That's the British mandated Palestine, 27,000 kilometers. After 1948 war and the armistice agreement, Israel ended up with 78% of British mandated Palestine, and 21%, which is the West Bank, became under the Jordanian rule, and 1%, that is the Gaza Strip and the southwest corner, became under the Egyptian control. And as you see over here, that was the situation until the war of 1967 on June and the morning of June 5th. So from 1949, the signing of the armistice agreements, until 1967, almost 20 years, these were the borders. So when we say two-state solution and we say the pre-1967 borders, we're talking about the green line. We're talking about 21%, that is the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and 1% the Gaza Strip. That's what the Palestinian wants. They want to make a state in here, in only 22% of mandated Palestine. Now let's go to Trump. And this constitutes roughly around, let's say, 6,000 square kilometers. This is the Trump. As you see, the West Bank is bisected. The West Bank is bisected into different sections, as you see. And the settlements, the Israeli settlements will be there. There will be, as you see, the Jordan Valley is detached from the West Bank. East Jerusalem is taken out, and all these settlements are there, checkpoints. And then there's a road supposed to connect Gaza with the West Bank. And then they added to Gaza 2 more areas in the south, in the desert, in the Negev desert, as like a form of land swap. Well, the Palestinians rejected this one. They don't want to even look at it. So this is not a starter. Yeah. So that's the maps. The maps for the Palestinians, as I said, is not a starter. Yes.
Now we're hosting this less than 50 hours before the United States election. The Arab Normalization, the new agreement, is arguably one of the largest achievements of Trump's foreign policy. Yet it's being hindered by COVID-19 and during the campaign, the candidates focused on domestic policy and implications it has for voters. So voters may not care as much about what's happening in the Middle East, but in case if Biden is elected, what does that mean for normalization? What does it mean for Middle East? How will Biden's office, what they will build on, and how will this impact the situation?
Well, I mean, Biden, for sure, he will go back to the framework of the two-state solution. He will try to get the Palestinians and the Israelis back to the negotiation tables, and he will adhere to the international community vision for ending Israel-Palestine conflict. That is the 1967 borders, negotiation over the 1967 borders, and arriving to a two-state solution. And we've seen that evident in the previous Democratic administration led by the former President Barack Obama and his Secretary of State back then, John Kerry. And we've seen their stand in the United Nations and the Security Council back then, and how the United States allowed for the passing of the resolution that basically condemns the settlements and calls for Israel to stop building settlements back then. So the Democrats, their vision is in line with the two-state solution, and they're going to try to bring back the Palestinians and the Israelis to the negotiation tables based on a two-state solution that is based on the 1967 borders, not an imaginary map that Kushner and Trump worked with Netanyahu and to produce. So that's what expected from Biden. Yes.
What country is likely to be next to establish ties with Israel?
Well, I mean, you know, they're talking about many countries, okay? They're talking about Oman, the Sultanate of Oman. They're talking about Morocco, but even some talk about Lebanon, some talk about Syria, okay? Because we've seen how is the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, he went on TV and he said, we have no problem normalization with Israel, making peace with Israel, but Israel has to end its occupation of Arab lands. So also we see now the Lebanese, they are negotiating their maritime, their sea borders with the Israelis, sponsored by the Americans. Is going on right now. So everywhere we see Israel, again, it's the activation of the regional approach. We can't end Israel-Palestine conflict directly. So let's go around and let's go and see the ally, because these are the allies. When we talk about allies in a conflict, the Saudis are the allies of the Palestinians, and they have been for the past 72 years. The Sudanese, the Egyptians, the Arabs, the Muslims, those are allies. They came with tanks and soldiers and they fought in 1948. And they have been boycotting for the past 72 years. But also, again, we must say that the Arabs at one point are saying, okay, we have our own problems, Palestine, sorry, okay? We have somehow to talk to Israel because we have a bigger problem now next to us, that is Iran. So as a Palestinian, I understand, okay, that the Bahrainis are looking for protection because in the end, it's their national interest at stake. So, and that's what drives states on the international arena. That is the protection of their national interest. So the Emiratis are scared from the Persians. The Bahrainis are scared from the Persians. That's why they want somebody to protect them. America cannot do it, then who can do it? Israel. So I understand that. But from a Palestinian point of view, I think it will be near impossible to have normalization and peace with Israel while the military occupation still continues.
Thank you. We have a question from the chat. Anna is asking, why would going back to the same method of negotiation work better now if done again?
There is no other. If you want to get to any conflict, you want to get to a solution, you must negotiate and you must try to arrive to a win-win situation. You need two to tango. Israel can negotiate with the wall. Israel can negotiate with an empty chair. But as long as there is no Palestinian, a legitimate Palestinian representative, a legitimate Palestinian representative has to sit in that other chair. And they have to negotiate directly. And they must arrive to a win-win situation where the Israelis feel safe and the Palestinians feel independent. That's how the formula. But there is no dictation when it comes to making peace and ending conflicts. Because as long as one party in the conflict feels that his rights he did not get and he got a bad deal, there will always be the seeds for future conflicts. You want to fix this. You want to fix the refugee problems. These are real people who lost their homes. My mother is a refugee. She's now almost 80 years old. She still talks about her house in the Galil and how her and her father and her mother became refugees and how they have to walk into Lebanon and to Syria near the Turkish borders, coming back to Damascus refugee camp. And there are 6 million like her. So without addressing the refugee problems and finding a solution, there will always be refugees who don't like Israel and want to make war because they feel that they lost. They have to agree on the borders, 1967 borders, natural resources, security arrangement, and all that must be done in negotiation. It's not up to Kushner or Trump in the White House to dictate. Yes.
Okay, thank you. If anyone else has other questions, you can ask them on the chat, or you can actually unmute yourself and participate in discussion.
My question is if you think that the normalization will succeed with the citizen of these countries, not just the government. Do you think the government and the citizen are on the same page in Bahrain and Emirates and these countries and Sudan as well?
With Sudan is going to be hard. Sudan is a big country, and we talk about millions of people. And also They were isolated for a long time. Their Muslim background is very strong. And Sudan always been a strong supporter of the Palestinian people. And we have elements, the Islamists there and the communists and the socialists. So the boycott, when it comes to this, the peace is going to be a cold peace, something similar to maybe Egypt peace with Israel. We have on the government level, they coordinate, they do the security stuff, but also the peace is cold when it comes to the Egyptian people and the Israeli people. It's cold because the occupation is still there. And they get to watch the news and they see the Israeli soldiers and the Palestinians, okay? So it's a cold peace. With the Emiratis, I think is different. I think with the Emiratis and the Bahrainis, is going to be maybe warmer peace than the peace between the Jordanian, the Egyptians, and the Israelis. The population is less of Emirat, talking in the hundreds of thousands. It's an open country, so they are really familiar to foreigners coming to Emirat, and Emiratis are familiar to going abroad. Same thing with Bahrainis. Those are internationalists. The people are internationalists in Bahrain and Emirat. These are two countries that are open, two countries that are very busy in international trade and investment and gas and petroleum. And I think the normalization with Emirat and Bahrain is going to be a warm normalization. They already have direct flights, like almost 20 or 40 flights going back and forth a week. And they already have agricultural trade, and we're already talking about using the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea to export the gas and petroleum from the Gulf countries to Europe, bypassing the Suez Canal. So I think the peace with Emirat and Bahrain and Israel is going to be a warm peace, unlike Sudan and Egypt and Jordan.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I would like to say two things. First, I'd like to respond to the question too and say that governments represent citizens, and citizens can't do anything about it, whether they like it or not. If a policy is passed or a policy is revoked, it all goes down to the government and what they choose to do. And second, relations and affairs with Israelis in the Arab world has always been going on. It's nothing new at all. It's been going on for years. The only difference now is that it's not under the table anymore and it's eye to eye. And that's it.
I also have a question. So we talk about like 90 Muslim countries, but 21, including Palestine, we said are Arab countries. So I was wondering about the rest, you know, what are their, you know, the positions for normalizations. And why I asked that, because when we talk about Palestine, there are other countries always behind the Palestine to support them because of the, you know, the common religion or also holy place we had in there. So what are their positions for the normalization? What do you think?
So the question is about the Muslim countries?
Yes, not Arab, like including my countries, such as Turkey or, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, we have Muslim countries and we have Arab countries. And when it comes to normalization, Muslim countries, historically, Turkey was the first Muslim country to recognize Israel, because back then Turkey was a secular country under secular rule and under the army rule. So we had strong relations between Turkey and Israel up until the arrival of Erdogan, who comes from a Muslim background. Erdogan is a Muslim. Erdogan, he sees himself as a Muslim, part of the Muslim world, and he views the Muslim in Jerusalem just like the Muslim in Istanbul. And Erdogan is outspoken about his position. He always criticizes Israel for its occupation. And the relationship between Turkey and Israel is not very good. And the only problem is the occupation and the problem with the Palestinians. That's why they have a problem, that the Turks and we've seen how the Turks tried to break the siege on Gaza. And we've seen how the Israelis commandos killed Turkish citizens trying to break the siege on Gaza. On the other hand, also with Iran, when the Shah of Iran was there and it was a secular monarch, they had a strong relation, the Israelis and the Persians. They had the strongest relations, the Iranians and the Israelis, until the downfall of the monarchy in Iran in the early 80s and the arrival of the Islamic Republic, Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran in the late 70s, early 80s. So, but you have countries like Afghanistan, for example, and countries like Pakistan, who are almost like at a state of war with Israel. And they don't have borders with Israel. They don't have, any problem with Israel, national resources or borders. It's just the fact that they're brothers in Jerusalem, in Gaza, in the West Bank, under the Israeli military occupation. So here you have millions of Muslims in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, in Afghanistan. They refuse to talk to Israel and normalize with Israel and visit Israel. So yes, it's the same, Muslims and Arabs. For the past 72 years have boycotted Israel. And they will continue to do, even though governments will make peace with Israel, but the people will continue to boycott until there is peace, permanent peace between Israel and Palestine, peace accord. Then the Arabs and the Muslims, they have no pretext, they have no reason then to boycott Israel. Because again, I say it 100 times, the only problem between the Arabs and the Muslims and the Israelis and the Jews is the issue of Palestine. Once that issue is solved, then there is no problem between the Arabs, Muslims, and Jews and Israelis. That's it. There is no problem. Other than the occupation, there is no problem. It needs to be solved.
I would like to highlight one point that Iran, for me, Iran is not an enemy for the Arab country or the Muslim world. Iran is like another Muslim country. They have different politics, they have different affairs, but they are not enemies to us, okay? Even I'm from a Sunni background, but that doesn't make Iran an enemy, okay? Iran wouldn't bump Saudi Arabia, wouldn't bump Emirates, like, as you mentioned, there is a majority of Shia in those countries as well. But that my point with Israel, like, it's a human right, it's purely human right point, okay? It is not even a religious point. When it comes to Israel, when we talk about Israel as a country, like, there is a lot of Palestinians, they cannot access education, healthcare, they cannot, like, they are held in the prisons. So that's my point with Israel. It is not the point that I'm not even talking about normalization. I'm talking about me accepting Israel. Like me, I have neighbors who they are Jews and we have a great relation together. But my point with the country and the government of Israel is a human right point, a conflict. Once this conflict is solved, one is Israel government is respecting the Palestinian citizen and giving them the right and giving them the access to education, to internet, and like, even before we talk about two-state solution, let's talk about how a humanitarian issues has to be solved inside between those neighbors, which is the Palestinian neighbors and the Israeli neighbors. Before a government like Bahrain or Emirates, who they are very privileged with the oil and the money of it, they go and do this normalization. We need to look at the living condition of Palestinians inside Palestine. If you ask me about the existence of Israel, I believe Jewish should be existing in every country in the Middle East or North Africa. They are an important component of all these countries. But when we talk right now how a country like Israel have suffered from a genocide, is doing a new genocide for a new population, which is they are Palestinian people. This is something I cannot get, and this is my problem with the Israel country. For me, the normalization will not succeed unless all these humanitarian issues are being solved by the Israeli government. And I don't see this is happening anytime soon. For the normalization was brought by a broker. I don't see the normalization was brought by politicians. Trump is not a politician. Trump, he's just like went from a broker, very spoiled family background. He went into the presidency through like I wouldn't talk about the American system, but for me, Trump, what he brought to the table, it cannot be maintained because what built on a wrong, it is wrong. So I hope to see that change coming from inside Israel, not from inside the United States, because United States is not in Asia or in Africa, United States in North America. And I hope to see the change happening within our countries, which is considering Israel one of them. Thank you, that's it.
We have a question in the chat from Anne. What is the definition that you are using of occupation when it comes to this?
Well, occupation, the definition of occupation, this has to do with the Geneva agreements following World War II. And they're speaking about and the definition of military occupation and what it entails and what the occupation can do and what the occupation cannot do. This is written in international law. And for example, it's prohibited under the Geneva Conventions for an occupied power to transfer its population to the occupied territories and establish colonies. And that's what Israel did in the West Bank, in Jerusalem and Gaza. So that's part of the military occupation I'm talking about. Israel is occupies the West Bank and Gaza militarily. And this is the international law. It's not the saying of the Palestinians. There's an occupation. I grew up under military occupation in the Gaza Strip. I'm Palestinian, native. I speak Arabic. I'm Muslim Sunni. And I grew up in the 70s. And in the early 80s, I came to realize that I live under the Israeli military occupation because I grew up seeing Israeli soldiers speaking Hebrew with M16s and guns and controlling us. Growing up, they have checkpoints and they ask us for our IDs. And if you speak about Palestine, they come at night and arrest you, to put you in prison. So that's the military occupation. We live under military occupation. We live under military occupation. Yes.
Someone else had their hand raised, I saw. If you want to speak, you can do it now. So there were some discussions in the chat. Yeah, Amina.
So I'd like the professor to elaborate more and answer, actually give more insight for Halima that's given her opinion about the Israeli and Iranian relations and international relations and how they weigh in on the Arab world. If you have more information on that and you can explain to all of us.
Yeah. So the region of the Middle East is a big region. It extends from Turkey, the Arab countries, all the way to Iran. And we have, namely, generally speaking, 4 nations that are contending for regional power. Those are the Turks, the Persian, the Arabs, and the Jews, the Israelis. Those, they want to be the regional power. And we see how is Turkey, after it was refused by the European Union, Turkey turned east. And now Turkey is involved more in the Middle East, and Erdogan is there. Okay, he wants to be the Sultan again, and that's Turkey. Okay, and we see how is the Persian. The Persian, they want to be strong. They want to have a nuclear bomb. They want to be able to sell their gas and their petroleum to Europe. And we see the Arabs after the fall of Iraq and the execution of Saddam Hussein. And the Arabs are in a miserable situation, and in comparison to the Persians and the Turks. And we see the Israelis are really advanced in the Middle East. And when it comes to military and economic and science, they also want to be a regional power, the Israelis. It's politics. And when it comes to international relations, as we know, there's the balance of power. And there's also, when it comes to politics, control and hegemony, and also the issue of practicing your power. So that's why Iran and Israel are on bad terms. Iran is interested, Iran is the Islamic Republic. They're interested in exporting their model of Islamic Republic to the Arab countries around. That means war. When you want to export, when you want to mess up my country and bring down my kingdom and change the political system, that means war. That's why Saudi Arabia is almost in a state of war with Iran. Because basically the Iranians, they're not happy with the kingdom, ruling family, the Saudis. Same thing, that the Persians are not happy with the kingdom of Bahrain, they're not happy with the kingdom of Emirat. They rather see a Muslim regime in these countries. And that's why the relation is bad. Now, when it comes to Israel, the Islamic Republic has a problem with Israel. And that problem has to do with the fact that the Islamic Republic sees Israel as an enemy. And since its inception, the Islamic Revolution, back in 1979s, 1980s, they called Israel Satan. So Iran also, and again, it's about interest again, that the Persians and the Israelis are fighting over control of the Middle East. Who's going to be the regional power? And also Turkey somehow is involved in that. But the and where is this battle happening? Where is the battleground for the Persians, the Turks, and the Israelis? It's the Arab world. We see what's happening in Syria, for example. Who's fighting in Syria? Okay. We've seen what's happening in Iraq. We see what's happening in Yemen. All these Arab countries, they are just battleground for regional control. Yeah. Which is sad.
Right. Thank you for comprehensive coverage that you have provided us in the last hour. I think we can wrap up here. Thank you to the audience for great questions and discussion. So not only we listened, but we also exchanged opinions and points of view on the issue. once again, thank you, Ezzeldeen, for coming. He represents OneVoice Movement, which you can find their website and find their Facebook page and follow what they're doing. Also follow IAPSS USA and Canada page. We try to host something like this event, a lecture discussion once a month. So if you follow, you can stay up to date as to what's happening in our region. You can also purchase an IAPSS membership, which costs about 17 American dollars a year or 23 Canadian dollars, and get access to all benefits IAPSS has to offer, including research committees, access to private events, and more. So thank you again everyone for coming, and I wish everyone a pleasant rest of this evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.